So I rarely watch straight politicians, whatever they're presenting to the public. I rarely watch that. I'll watch some media show that I like and I trust, and they kind of filter the information for me that seems relevant because, well, I suppose I watch them mostly because they align with my values or perspective politically. And I suppose most people do this. Is that right?
It depends. There's a lot
Okay.
of variability in it. So there are certainly some folks that get really entrenched in their media diets, but there are a lot of omnivores, media omnivores, I think of them as, right, where they're trying to consume something that's a broader range of media, particularly it seems on issues that they care about. So if someone cares about the environment, there certainly might be, a channel on YouTube that they're following, and or something that they like that makes that important, and on social media following activists, but might also tune in to see what the other side is saying about a particular issue. That's one of the things that I find frustrating about audiences is there's in the literature, there's a whole lot of debate about are people just getting more polarized because of their media consumption? And yes, some people absolutely are, but there are some people that absolutely are not. A grad student and I just did some research on this where we actually looked at around the 2020 election, we looked at the Arizona audit debate when it was then Twitter. And one of the things that when we looked at the audiences and who was comprised of different kinds of audiences, we found that conservatives had really diverse diets. Some of that might just be because not all the conservatives were clearly on board with Trump and his argument that the election was stolen. But I think generally speaking, what Pew will sometimes, Pew reviews, Pew Research Center will find is that, yeah, I mean, people have more diverse diets than we like to think. And that certainly that was one of the things we included in our survey for our young adults. And we asked them about people are looking for, and we didn't ask how they define this because we had a finite amount of time, but they're looking for facts, they're looking for truth. And I don't know what that means for a particular individual, but they're looking further afield than you would think.
You think people are looking for facts or narratives?
I think they're probably looking for a bit of both, right? Narratives are
Okay.
stories. Humans love stories. So we have
Yeah.
the stories that we like and that we agree with. And sometimes we think, oh, are there other stories? Are there other tales that are told about this issue? So I think that there's certainly that. I think there can be facts put out everywhere. People are just looking for reliable sources. And on the one hand, I think that this is good because folks are thinking about how data are collected and being used in the ways that we didn't think about decades ago. So I always think about how, we used to be terrified about the planes crashing or falling from the sky. We were worried and worried. I remember being a kid and thinking, oh my gosh, I hope we never have to fly because it's, the accidents, the airline accidents. But actually now we know, okay, this is actually a small percentage. And we think about media narratives regarding how facts are displayed. And are they showing us the whole graph or just part of it? So in some ways, we're better consumers and we're better understanders of data, particularly if we're skeptical. But I think it would be nice if we had a shared space like we used to, where we used to have at least some common information that we were processing together. And that's just kind of a result of our complicated and media ecosystem where you have abundancy of choices and people creating their own notions of fact, and anybody can create a website and put some numbers in a table, right? So we used to just have our broadcast news and maybe then a few cable stations. So we at least were getting some shared information to process and argue over. Now we're not even talking about the same data sources sometimes, right? So if we can't even agree on sources of data to fight about, that's a problem, right? We need to find something to a shared pool of resources information resources to fight over or fight about so that we can think about decision making in a more productive way.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was getting at with the narrative because you'll see the same event portrayed on different medias. Same, even sometimes the same facts, but sometimes they'll pick different facts from the same thing, right?
So one of the things that I've been looking at is a lot of headlines. And what I found so interesting, and I know there's a clickbait aspect to it, but not always, is there's such a huge disconnect between the headline and the actual story. So sometimes you'll have these very extremely ideological, incorrect headlines, but then the story's pretty good. But if you're only reading the headline, which we know people do, then what you're taking from the story that you didn't read is actually not what you should be taking from it. But headlines are supposed to get you to read, but they don't always. But that is part of the narrative, right? So we're trying to craft a narrative that resonates with an identity. Some of it, we want the outlet makes money, the politician can make money, an interest group can make money if they can generate this rage, but not all of that narrative is always consistent. So you might have this very, again, just emotionally laced headline where the story is actually much better. And pretty, like I said, factually pretty good.
Most issues, I suppose, aren't really portrayed well as just a set of facts, right? They're so complex. I can think of like the wars, the two big wars that the US is, involved in, that you can't have all the facts. What matters is the narrative, and each side constructs a narrative based on the facts that they find important. Do they just pick the one that they like? Do people shop around for different narratives and kind of see what other people are saying? Or I definitely tend to listen to people more who fit my biases, not just because it feels good and it fits my bias, but because there's so many assumptions baked into some of the other narratives that I don't agree with, that it seems like a waste of time.
Yeah, no, I mean, again, you're getting at that. Some of it's sort of your personal orientation to how you respond to narratives and how you seek them out. Right. So there, again, can be folks that say, yeah, I mean, this is not the starting place, their foundation. I'm not there. So the
Yeah.
narratives that they're producing, I'm not there. One of the things that I find really interesting that social scientists have been looking at for over a decade is how narratives increasingly can come from the kind of the margins of the media system. So the most kind of partisan outlets, and build steam and increasingly get into more mainstream audiences, So that's something that has fundamentally changed. So when you think about narrative, I think one of the things that we tend to do, and again, I've already talked about why the value of creating extreme narratives, but they move in ways, they cross over from outlets in ways that they didn't in the past. And that fuzzies this whole narrative environment as well.
Yeah, I've heard about that. People worry about that as part of the polarization, where the more centralized ones kind of sanitize some of the extreme positions as they filter in.
Right, and we don't have that shared space anymore, right? So it used to be we had outlets that we were attending to where we had spaces. I mean, I don't really think of any of our social media platforms, including X's, spaces where people are having meaningful debates. There's plenty of yelling or exclamation points and rhetoric to try to get likes and shares, but there's not that kind of public forum where consensus is made. In fact, because we have parties where consensus is no longer desirable because the other side is your enemy, the narratives on each side are just going to increasingly get insular unless, I mean, I would argue mostly us, unless we do something about it, right? We can't do anything about the perverse incentives unless enough of us change our behavior in ways that are going to then make the perverse incentives change as well, right?
You'll see this competing over the narrative from both sides, as well as I was thinking of particularly over naming things is where it becomes very apparent to me. So like Obamacare versus the Affordable Care Act, I know was a big one. And I saw an interview with he was a Republican strategist, and he was really proud that he got the estate tax into the public lexicon as named the death tax. These very kind of simple messaging is really, I guess, dominates the discussion.
Yeah, well, and whoever frames the debate gets to, you're
Yeah.
saying, here's how, this is the problem, this is how we need to understand the problem, which fundamentally shapes how you solve the problem, right? So there's a lot of value in shaping the debate or getting the language adopted that you adopted that you want. And that's why, so, activists, sometimes they realize they're not going to get the change that they want, but if they get, the first step is just getting the language used that you want, then that's the first step on the road of getting the actual change, right? You have to be able to first get your issue and how you think about it as part of the political lexicon, maybe popular lexicon, and then you have a chance to actually shape the solutions, because now they've adopted your framework for understanding the problem.